I want to talk about blue zones, which people will probably have heard of. There's been various Netflix documentaries and other books, hundreds of books actually on the blue zones. And for people who don't know, the blue zones are essentially areas of the world where people are particularly long-lived. And some of these areas are quite surprising in that they're not the wealthiest and most sort of technologically advanced parts of the world, but they are often sort of small communities which have lots of people which live for a particularly long time. And so a lot of people have studied that, and people have looked at the diet of people in those zones. And some of the examples are some certain part of Sardinia, some of the Greek islands. There's an area of Costa Rica which is particularly has a lot of particularly long-lived people, and Okinawa in Japan, and some other parts of Japan as well. So, people look at the diets and look for commonalities and try and get an understanding of what it is that gives you a long life and a long, healthy life, because obviously that's incredibly important in understanding health. Huge amount of books, huge amount of coverage, documentaries. I've written about it in one of my books. In my second book, I wrote a little bit about it. And actually, my view was that it wasn't really about diet. It was actually more about certain sort of values and lifestyles and valuing people as they got into old age. So it's really easy to get into this sort of narrative of trying to find these common links between these different areas. But there's a researcher from UCL Centre for Longitudinal Studies, a guy called Justin Newman. And last year, he did some really interesting research in the blue zones and found out that there's a really common link between all these areas of the world where people are particularly long-lived. And that is that common factor that links them all is pension fraud. He found out that, actually the quote from him is that most extreme old data is junk to a shocking degree. And found out that in almost every single area where people were particularly long-lived, the actual reality was a lot of it was based on pension fraud. He said the key to long life is to move where birth certificates are rare, teach your kids pension fraud, and start lying. In fact, there's one particularly interesting example is the guy who was supposed to be Japan's longest lived person, the oldest person living in Japan, was found out to have died in 1978. And his family have actually been claiming his pensions for 3 decades. And just by the nature of that, he was registered as Japan's oldest living person. And he found out 82% of Japanese centurions, 230,000 people, were either missing or dead, because it seems to be an easy route to manipulating the system and claiming pension for a long time in Japan and a lot of these other areas. And so he basically found that these areas, which have been sort of lionized as these great examples of how a particular lifestyle could make you live a particularly long way, a long time, were actually just, the figures were being manipulated. People were claiming that they were their parents, and were claiming after their parents had died, and were claiming sort of pensions for long times. And it really struck me that it's really easy to buy into a narrative sometimes, and we have to be really careful and step back, because it's probably fairly obvious that the easiest route to long life is modern medicine and wealth and having an easy lifestyle and sort of following certain basic health advice. There is no magic secret to be found in the mountains of Sardinia or the islands of Greece. It's really about stuff we knew anyway. And I find it really interesting just because of this relation to food and how people have been sort of trying to lionize these sort of diets from various different regions and sell cookbooks and sell lifestyle advice. That sometimes it's really valuable to step back and have a look at what's actually going on, because often the story we want to tell ourselves ends up manipulating the truth.